All right, it looks like there's probably a few more people that'll continue to trickle in here, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone who's joining us today to our webinar, 4 Tips to Make Your Brand More Consistent. We're really excited to be with you here today, and we're happy that you chose to spend some time with us. We think we have a really interesting topic here and some valuable tips to share with you. So without further ado, let's jump in. So by way of brief introduction, it's always good to know who you're listening to, right? I'm Garrett Jestice. I'm head of marketing at Lucidpress. Lucidpress is a web-based content creation and brand management platform created by Lucid Software. So I started here with Lucid Software a few years ago as the first marketing hire and have kind of worn all the marketing hats over the last little while. And today I help to lead our product marketing, content strategy, and lead generation teams. And today I'm also joined by Ashley Spurlock, Solutions Marketing Manager at Workfront, and I'll let her introduce herself to you and her impressive background.
Perfect, thanks. Yep, I'm Ashley Spurlock. I'm a Solutions Marketing Manager here at Workfront. Workfront offering work management solutions, including a review and approval tool and, of course, a DAM solution to lots of different customers. We've got agencies, IT, PMO customers, general marketing is kind of our bread and butter, and we're excited to be here and partner with Lucidpress to talk to you guys today.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thanks, Ashley. So we feel like the tips that we're going to share with you guys today are very valuable, but really the only way that you're going to get the value out of this webinar is if you stick around to the end. So here is our shameless bribe for all of you listening. So if you stay to the end of this webinar today, we're going to give you a free copy of each of the 2 reports that you see here. So the first, the impact of brand consistency, the one you see on the left, is a report that Lucidpress recently created together with a research firm called Demand Metric. So for this report, we interviewed over 200 senior marketing and brand leaders at different sizes of companies and across many different industries. And we asked them questions related to the topic of brand consistency. And this summarizes those impactful findings, and we're going to share some of those findings today with you. The second that you see here on the right is one that Workfront put together, and Ashley, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, thanks Garrett. Yeah, this piece we like to call the last mile of marketing projects. We're talking about the review and approval process part of a marketing project. That's something that I work on day in and day out as far as targeting that messaging to our prospects and customers. Some really great tips in there, though, that have nothing to do with our product, something that you could implement today, and especially a little discussion about marketing compliance. So if that's interesting to you, check out that piece.
Thanks, Ashley. So here is our agenda for the day. So to start it off, we're going to talk a little bit brand consistency is important. And then we're even going to share some of that data from that report that I just showed you to kind of back up our tips and our claims. And next we'll dive in deep to each of the 4 tips that you see here about how to make your brand more consistent. And lastly, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So we want to hear questions from you. So as you have questions today, as something comes up, feel free to write them in that chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. So here we go. Why is brand consistency important? Or better yet, how important should brand consistency be to you and to your company? When we began the research for the impact of brand consistency report that we showed you here at the beginning, these are some of the questions that we really wanted to answer. Again, we surveyed over 200 senior marketing and brand leaders across a variety of companies and industries. And one of the first questions we asked them was, how often are marketing, communications, or sales materials created that don't conform to brand guidelines? And from this study, you can see from this graph here that 90% of participants experience some level of inconsistent branding in the materials that they create. So I'm curious too, for all of you, how would you answer this question? How often are materials created at your organization that don't conform to brand guidelines? I bet it's a lot. I know that it happens a lot at our organization, even though we're big proponents of brand consistency. It at least happens probably more than you would like to see. So from the previous question, the study participants, they indicated that they always, often, or sometimes have materials created that don't comply with their brand guidelines, we're asked this follow-up question. If your brand was always presented consistently, how much do you estimate that your organization's revenue would increase? And the average response was 23%, which, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that's pretty crazy to me. Who wouldn't want a 23% increase in revenue next year? Like, I know if we took that to our leaders here, they would love that. To me, this really means that even though there's a cost associated with maintaining brand consistency, there's clearly a significant revenue benefit that more than offsets those potential costs. So moving along, though, what about that other group from that first question? Those who said that they rarely or never see materials created and deployed that don't comply with brand guidelines. Well, they're definitely the minority, right? But they were also asked a similar follow-up question, which is this: how do you feel that the brand consistency you've maintained has contributed to the growth of your organization? And this chart, to me, shares what is perhaps the most important finding from this study that we did. It's that organizations that make an effort to maintain brand consistency experience a growth dividend from doing so. Almost 85% of those firms that invest in maintaining brand consistency attribute 10% or more growth to their efforts. And 1 in 5 are realizing more than 20% or greater growth. So if you signed up for this webinar today, you probably already realize how important brand consistency should be for your organization. Or if not, hopefully this data is starting to convince you. But understanding that brand consistency is important is really only the first step. More important is figuring out how to do it, right? So without further ado, let's continue. Let's jump into the tips. So tip number 1 is to pick the right brand champion. So let's go back to the data again for a second. This figure teaches some things about who should manage and protect your brand if brand consistency is important to your organization. Survey respondents were first asked how important maintaining brand consistency was for their company, and then later they were asked this question: who in your organization has primary responsibility to manage and protect how your brand is used? This graph shows the intersection of the responses to those two questions. What you should pay attention to when looking at this graph is really the difference in the responses from those organizations for which consistency was important, which is in the dark orange, and those for which consistency was unimportant or neutral, which is in the lighter orange. So for organizations who consider brand consistency to be important, 44% of them have the CMO or another corporate marketing executive serve as the quote-unquote brand champion, compared to only 30% of those organizations who consider brand consistency to be unimportant. You can see a similar big gap with regards to the CEO as you look at this chart. So if brand consistency is important to your organization, which it should be, primary responsibility for managing and protecting the brand should probably fall to the CMO or another corporate marketing executive, as we kind of learned from this. And while it seems unrealistic for the CEO to serve as the brand manager, when the CEO recognizes the importance of managing the brand, it sends a clear message to everyone that the brand is worthy of protection and also investment. So one surprising takeaway from this, as I dove into the data, the involvement of the corporate creative or design team or an outside agency, as you see here, varies little by whether the company considers brand consistency to be important or not. So for you creatives who are listening to this webinar today, whether you're in-house or you work on the agency side, that means that it's incredibly important for you to help the organizations that you work with understand the importance of encouraging the CMO and the CEO to become those brand champions.
Excellent. Thanks, Garrett. This is my cue here, this slide, talking about picking a champion. So the first example I want to share here is about our CMO, actually, talking about how the CMO should be the brand champion. Our CMO has been here for, I don't know, two years or so. And when he joined, he talked to our team a lot. Our team focuses a lot on content marketing. Of course, we do other things, but we produce a lot of ebooks and white papers and thought leadership pieces. And in the past, we had produced very unique pieces. So one piece had a theme of maybe work is a circus, and the other piece had a theme of work is like The Walking Dead, so it's The Working Dead or whatever. And every piece looked like it came from a different company. Yes, they had fun, exciting, different themes, but there was nothing that really, I guess, flowed them together. So one of his first initiatives, which to some of the people on our team felt like, oh, why are we working on this, was to make sure that our brand message or our brand style was the same on all of our ebooks and white papers. And that was a really big initiative for him. And then the next thing that he did, which showed how important making sure that our brand was consistent, was to rebrand our company. We moved from @Task to Workfront. And that was a really big deal and really important to show that the messaging on even just down to ebooks and white papers was consistent with the messaging from a whole, from a larger perspective. The second story, though, that I want to share, though, is that it's important that your champions are also farther down the line, right? My team, the Solutions Marketing team, is quite large, and we're divided into smaller teams within that big team in order to better target specific audiences that use or could use our product. Within each team, we're expected to be subject matter experts and create personas that we would target, right? We're supposed to be the experts on what their pains are, what their challenges are, and to really understand exactly what their needs are. For example, my team is over agencies, general marketers that would use a review and approval tool, and anyone that would need a DAM product like Workfront DAM. So my job is to understand who the personas are at an agency, be a champion for them, and understand how our product actually helps them solve their problems. And then, of course, my teammate is responsible to be the champion for whatever persona he's targeting as well. So that really leads me to my second point here, which is that you should define the roles. It's important to define the right brand champion within your team. Yes, the CMO, like I mentioned, is the brand champion for your organization, and yes, marketing is the brand champion for how you market to the audience you sell to, but do you have a defined role on your team to show who sticks up for that audience? I make a joke here with my team. I've worked at Workfront for almost 3 years, and I feel like every 6 months my job changes. Whether it's when I first started, I was marketing to IT teams, then I moved to professional services, and then I moved to general marketers and now agencies, right? I guess that's maybe more than an average of 6 months, but I have to relearn something every time, right, or learn something new. And I'm always training up the next person who's going to take over that audience. And I always tell that person, whoever it is, that it's important that they become the champion for that persona or that audience that we're going to target, because no one else on our team is going to be responsible for them. And by being the champion for your brand, for that audience, you're going to make sure that everything that that audience gets is very consistent. So let's say, for example, it's the agency persona. When they read a blog post, I'm invested to see that those blog posts have the same type of messaging as an ebook that they review, or a webinar that they attend, or an experience with the product that they get. So it's really important to define that role and really become a champion for your brand. Okay, so the second part is that once you have your roles defined, it's important that you build whatever assets your organization needs so they can be consistent in your effort to be that brand champion. So for example, let's say you build brand guidelines or personas or maybe messaging that's directed at a specific audience. We always write playbooks, for example. It's important that you get the stakeholder buy-in that you need. For my organization, it's really important that we get sales to buy off on personas. The CMO has to approve it. Our digital marketing team has to be on the same page. They do a lot of the execution of the marketing activities that we plan. We all have to agree that we're talking to the customer in the right way, and that we're representing the brand in the same way, so that we're all on the same page. And when we go off and work on all of our various activities, that customer has the same experience. That's really important. Okay, so for the third point, once you have your content in a set of guidelines, or maybe it's in a brand portal, it's important that it's accessible to the right people. If you utilize a DAM, for example, make sure that the link is accessible to your marketing team, to freelancers that you might use, or other folks in the organization. If you have a brand portal, and that, of course, can often make it easier to see exactly what is updated and when, instead of a PDF that's maybe static and harder to be maintained. If you have a brand portal, you can update your font section or your messaging section. Anyone with a link to that section can get an update. Maybe they get a notification. Or when they go to that page, they can see the most up-to-date approved content when they log in to check the brand guidelines. This, of course, helps everyone in the org that is being tasked or has a role that is defined as a brand champion be a better brand champion. And in fact, I think that's to tip number 2. Garrett, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Awesome tips. So tip number 2 is make your brand guidelines easier to find. So going back to the research, when it comes to the effectiveness of brand guidelines, typically the problem isn't that the guidelines aren't current or that they're hard to comply with, as you see here in this figure. The issue is simply that too often they're hard to find. And the best set of brand guidelines really is no use if they're difficult or impossible to find. So when looking more closely at this data actually that we used to build this graph, only 40% of respondents said that their brand guidelines were easy to find. And this is only those respondents from the survey who had previously rated the effectiveness of their brand guidelines as good or very good, which is pretty crazy to me. So when we take a closer look at those people who said that their brand guidelines were poor or very poor, just 9% said that their brand guidelines were easy to find. So that's pretty crazy. And to me, that illustrates that having brand guidelines that are difficult to find does no good. It really just robs them of their power to help drive that brand consistency. So how do you make your brand guidelines easier to find? Well, our first tip here is to offer brand guidelines in multiple formats. So going back to the data again for a second, analyzing the data revealed really a relationship between the number of formats in which brand guidelines are made available and how well enforced they are, as you can see here in this table. So the more serious a firm is about enforcing brand guidelines, the more formats in which those brand guidelines are offered. Offering brand guidelines in many formats also makes them easier to find, which is a characteristic that's strongly related to how effective they are, which is pretty interesting. So moving along, what formats should you offer your brand guidelines in? So I think probably the most common format for brand guidelines is the PDF. So as I previously mentioned, I work for a company called Lucid Software, and one of our products, Lucidpress, at its core is really a web-based content creation platform. It's essentially an easy-to-use web-based version of Adobe InDesign. And we offer hundreds of templates for everything from brochures to business cards or even a brand style guide like what you see here. So if you were to come and use this template, all you would need to do is update it with your brand colors, your fonts, your logos, and then you could even download it as a PDF, or better yet, you could publish it as an interactive version of the document online that automatically updates when you make any changes. So there's no more of that searching around for the most current version of the brand guidelines PDF. So if you're just getting started or don't yet have brand guidelines or want to go back and revisit and update them, I'd recommend using this template. Another format idea is to offer your brand guidelines in the actual tools where your employees are creating content. So Lucidpress Brand Assets functions essentially as a living brand guidelines. So you as the team administrator can set the brand colors, fonts, logos, and everything else for your team in the Lucidpress tool. And then those correct brand assets are served up when anyone on your team goes in to change a color or a font or an image. They see your brand colors and your brand fonts right there, right at their fingertips. So it eliminates the need to go searching for that hex code or the most current version of your logo or anything else like that. And I think that Ashley, this is you, so we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so I read a stat the other day. It said that more than 73 organizations recently surveyed say they must comply with regulatory and or brand standards. We all know that compliance issues don't just apply to legal departments anymore. They're part of marketing, right? And this is why tip number 2, require that your reviewers follow a style guide. And of course, those brand guidelines that we're talking about is so important. It's so important that your singular marketing message is maintained in multiple formats. Because your marketing message is maintained in multiple formats, whether that's social media, mobile, websites, whatever it is, it needs to be maintained. It needs to be consistent. It's crucial to accurately express and maintain that brand voice, no matter the content, no matter where it's stored. And of course, the best way to establish that consistency is by setting some simple compliance standards, and one of those is a style guide. Maybe you're adhering to an in-house editorial guide, or maybe it's an official guide like Chicago Manual of Style. That's what we use internally. And you can also modify that. We use Chicago, but we have some outlying or some outliers rules that we use that are different than Chicago, because that's what works better for our brand. It's just important that you select one and that you implement it. If you don't have one or don't know where to start, the example, of course, that Garrett shared would be a great asset to check out, and just go ahead and get started. I started my career out as a copywriter, and in several of the places I've worked, creating a style guide is just as important, if not a partnership, as creating those brand guidelines. They often work hand in hand, and they just are so vital to the success of both of them. I had a creative director once that spent months and months and months, like this is the only thing he worked on brand guidelines, and he didn't even think once about adding messaging or the style guidelines at all. After the brand guidelines were finished, he, a designer's time and all, it just was such a large project. We didn't have anything to send to freelancers or other writers or agencies or new folks that joined the team to understand how we wanted to represent our company in a messaging format. So making sure that you implement that is really, really important. My advice, if you don't have a style guide, get working on one now. Even if you have, like a Google Doc or a Word doc open while you work on projects, it's just helpful to jot down those notes so you can create a clean version later. Just get it down on paper. Okay, so for the third one, make clear the intended final use of the project. I'm kind of chuckling here because it's one of my favorite things to talk about here. I like to call this avoiding fourth quarter coaching. Everyone knows how this goes, and especially if you're a writer or a designer or even a marketing manager, I'm sure, and this applies as well. You're working on a project, you think you've done everything right. You have an outline that's beautiful, you've done just a great job on your first and second and third drafts, you send it to a designer, it's got this beautiful layout, you feel like you've included all the right people. You get to the fourth quarter, and I mean, I'm not even like a real big sports fan, but you get to that fourth quarter, and what happens? Some stakeholder that did look at it, they might have already looked at it, takes a better look at it and says, oh yeah, this needs to change, or actually this isn't the way this project's going to be used, and oh, I had this information from so-and-so, and I forgot to tell you about it. And you get that fourth quarter coaching, and you have to go back to the beginning, and that information would have been so vital in that first quarter or when you first started. It just kind of screws up the whole process, right? So it's so important that you make clear the intended final use of that project so that you're not wasting people's time. I have another really great example, though. I worked for this company where we did a lot of print ads, and we were doing a specific ad for healthcare. It was actually it was directed at nurses, and we used a stock image, and so we put the stock image of a nurse on this ad, and we had all our content on there. It was beautiful and everything, and we sent it off to the magazine, and I'm not really sure if we had the opportunity to look at the magazine in layout or whatever, but we got the final back, and what happened, but on the page next to ours, so directly across, just in a beautiful spread, a competitor used the same image that we had used. So same stock image on the left and on the right, and it was just like, wow, the final usage of this piece is going to go in this magazine, and if we would have known that someone else was using the same image, that would have been really helpful information. Maybe something that we couldn't have avoided in that case, but kind of a funny way to illustrate the point. So it's just so important to make sure that the final usage is made so clear at the beginning. If you can do that, then reviewers can obviously approach their review through the appropriate lens and better understand what they need to verify. Maybe an example would be knowing that a project that's going to be used as a retail package will prepare the reviewer to see that they need to look at industry standards or specific requirements, maybe like font sizes or other compliance standards, and check that out as they're reviewing. So again, just such a big deal. That's really important. Okay, so for the fourth one, allowing for easy comparison between content. Of course, the example I shared about the ads, that would have been helpful to compare those two together. But it's important that if you're on the path to consistent brand marketing, that you have the ability to review documents side by side. yes, you can print them out and look at versions 2 and 3 next to each other, and you should definitely do that if that's what you have to work with. But a better solution, and obviously one that I recommend and our company recommends, is using an online proofing tool. And that way you can actually view versions in a digital format right next to one another. And this way you can say, like, for example, let's say your legal team added some compliance notes to a mortgage offer if you're working on something like that. You can see that the notes they left the designer in round 2 are actually implemented in round 3. Or any of the brand changes. Let's say there's been a big brand change and someone makes a comment on version 2. You can see that that's changed on version 3 side by side. The team I work with now, the team of designers I work with now, they never or rarely miss any kind of update, but I've definitely worked with designers in the past where it kind of added more time to my day. I had to go back and look at either a printout or an email that I'd sent or however I had proofed a document, and it just added a lot of time in order to make sure that those changes I left were actually made. Okay, so are we on number 4 or 5? Here we go, number 5. Attaching requirements to project workflows. This, of course, goes along with my 4th quarter coaching philosophy. But not only should requirements be vetted and approved by key stakeholders, they should be attached to the project itself. Let's say you go through the trouble of approving a project, you got time on the CMO's calendar, he or she said yes, you got approval from legal on some wording on an offer, and then your manager, he gives you the green light on your outline. If you don't include those requirements that everyone has approved with the project and keep them nearby for that easy access or quick review, you might where you're off track. You haven't remembered all the brand guidelines you added to the project description or outline, or your freelance talent or agency just doesn't remember how to find that document. So it's important that you attach those requirements to that project workflow. And I think that leads us to number 3. Tip number 3, I'll hand it over to you, Garrett.
All right, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, we're about a little more than halfway through here. So tip number 3 is ensure enforcement of those brand guidelines. So moving back into the research. So I guess before we start here, I'm curious. Raise your hand if you have employees at your company who have gone rogue, so to speak, and created their own marketing, sales, or communication materials that didn't conform to brand standards. Or raise your hand if you've done that before. I know I probably have. And obviously I can't see you if you're raising your hand, but most of you should have your hands in the air right now. In this study, just 10% of participants shared that this problem never happens to them. And of that minority who report that they never or rarely have those rogue materials created at their company, this chart shows that well over half of them, 58%, report having formal brand guidelines that are consistently enforced. So minimizing how often rogue materials are created isn't just a matter of having guidelines. How well you enforce them is the key to minimizing this problem. So I think, Ashley, we're going to kick back over to you right here for this tip of how to enforce those brand guidelines.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Garrett. Yeah, our tip number 1 here is to templatize your process for review and approval. It's important that you gather some feedback from your team if you don't already have this in place. You can gather feedback on the process. You know, what do you like? What do you not like? What would make it better? To establish a clear workflow that's visible to all parties involved, and one that should be checked off by communicating with your stakeholders, of course, who would understand the roadblocks of your current process. Getting their input on the approval of your workflow will help you ensure that you've chosen a feasible work timeline or workflow timeline, and of course those expectations that are involved. Visibility, of course, is so key here. Whether it's from concept to delivery, the more your reviewers can see what decisions are required of them, when they need to give those decisions to you or when they're due, and how to best keep their feedback in line with other reviewers, the more that they'll actually achieve the tone, the goals, and the purpose of your project, and of course keeping your brand consistent. That's why you need to consistently and clearly document the workflow. Okay, so whether that means tracking it in an online proofing tool, maybe you're color coding each workflow phase and updating the color as you progress, or you're adding the reviewer's initials to the document name after they've reviewed something. That's something that I've done in a previous job. We had to print documents, and everyone approved it by initialing it, and that's what worked for us at the time, and that's okay. So those are just examples. Again, though, this is just one of my other favorite topics. I'm just going to nerd out the whole webinar, if that's okay. But if you're actually going to enforce those brand guidelines, say maybe legal has to take a quick look at legal jargon on a marketing offer, it could be maybe healthcare or finance related, you must include legal or compliance in your review and approval process, and make sure that you include them in a standard workflow that you can templatize for future work. So without that workflow outlined for work that you repeat often, you're going to miss steps. I guarantee it. Even the best of us with the best intentions, if it's not documented and you don't have a templatized process, you're probably going to miss somebody. Something will fall through the cracks, right? I read another stat the other day that stated that marketing projects often require at least 4 reviewers, and those reviewers are often not the same from project to project. It could be new people or someone from Department A or Department B, or it's this team and that person left and so it's this person now. That changes, right? If you can document the process, define the roles within that project, maybe not necessarily who's going to be doing it, but the role that needs to review it, of course including that brand champion, and repeat it. Your process will get faster, it'll be more efficient, and you won't miss a key stakeholder review, which is going to be so important, especially to avoid that fourth quarter coaching. Okay, so the next part is providing an outline at the beginning of each project, and we're going to offer some tips here for that. Just like that documented process, it's important to give everyone a job at the beginning of the project. It's all about managing expectations. That is like my personal life philosophy, but it is so applicable to this tip especially. If you give your reviewers a detailed outline showing how much time they'll have to review the project, and you get backing, of course, from the right stakeholders, your deadlines will be tight, your reviewers will be responsive, everything that we want, right? Make it clear that if your reviewers don't get back to you in time, maybe they're not going to have a chance to review it at all. Or if they don't get back to you in time, make sure they understand the cost of waiting. Make sure they understand that if you don't get it back in 2 days, that means your project's going to be 2 days late. It's just important to manage those expectations. I need you to do X, and if you don't do X, this is what's going to happen, and that's just part of the way it goes. Of course, as you develop those outlines, it's important to consider 2 things. The first thing, what are the most commonly reviewed types of projects that you review? Is it web content, presentations, print ads, packaging, whatever you can use to templatize the outline, that'll just save you so much time in the long run. The second thing is you want to make sure that you remember or look into how many reviewers are typically involved. Like I said, on average it's 4, but you need to look at your process and make sure that you're implementing that. Okay, for the third one, standardize the communication of feedback. All right, so marketers reportedly spend 16% of their time in emails and 20% of the work week searching for internal information. Wow, that's like a crazy waste of time, right? What can you do about that? What can we all do about that? I'm sure that many of you have spent lots of time looking for information. In fact, I just remembered a story that I could share with you. I worked as a PM at one of my last jobs, and in order to prepare for status meetings, I would spend like 2 or 3 hours before the status meeting just gathering content from other people, or like we had a shared Excel, I guess it was a shared Google spreadsheet or whatever it's called, a Google sheet, talking to other people or searching through my email just to get information. It just was not, the communication was not in a central location. It took up a lot of my time. So that 20% of the work week searching for internal information, gosh, I know that all too well. In addition to providing reviewers, though, with an outline, one of the most important things you can do to cut down on wasted time sifting through and, of course, searching for information is to address that hugely inefficient, manual, resource-heavy process of gathering feedback across multiple channels. I also started my career, like I mentioned, as a copywriter, and I spent lots of time or lots of years as a senior copywriter, so I would have to be the one interfacing with people to get approval or feedback. And having to put documents on chairs was part of my job, right? Put a document on my creative director's chair just to get him to review something. So gathering that feedback can be such a waste of time. So something you can do to consider, or something you can consider to change that, of course, is standardizing that communication of feedback, whether that's from a Google Doc, or maybe it's having everyone review a printout, or everyone's just in the same email thread. I mean, I think that's probably the worst example or worst suggestion, but definitely if everyone can do the same thing and provide their feedback in the same way, that's going to help you a lot. Of course, the tip that I would recommend is the best is to implement some kind of social collaboration tool. where you can communicate in the context of work, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But however, you can standardize the process and push it into processes that look similar to the other things in your life, like, for example, Twitter or Facebook, where you can see that people are making comments, timestamped, you can see who's reviewed it or who's replied. If you could implement that into your process, that's going to help standardize that communication of feedback. And then I think this fourth tip is back to you, Garrett. I'll let you take over.
Yes. Thanks, Ashley. So the last tip here is just to create a library of templates for content creation and then lock those templates down. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a second, but I want to address this because I think this might initially seem a bit counterintuitive at first. So if you want to enforce your brand guidelines and prevent employees from creating their own rogue materials, why would you want to create templates for them to use? The short answer is you're probably never going to be able to prevent all employees from going rogue and creating their own content. Remember that stat we shared previously that only 10% of survey respondents said that they never have this problem, and honestly, I wonder how many of them were actually telling the truth or just didn't know about the rogue content that was being created at their companies. I think it's something that happens at pretty much every company. So in addition, though, showing employees examples of what good materials look like that adhere to brand guidelines is one of the best ways to help them know how to follow those guidelines when they're actually creating content. And templates are a great way to do that. Better yet is creating templates in which you can lock down and enforce your brand guidelines. So moving right along, Lucidpress is one tool that you could use to create those templates and share them out with different groups across your organization. So, for example, you could create some flyer templates for your events team, some social media templates for your social team, and some proposal templates for your sales team. And the best part about Lucidpress, the thing that I love about it the most, is that you can lock down the size and position, the style, and the content of different elements in each of those templates. So, for example, if I was creating this flyer template for Lucid software, I could easily lock down the logo so that no one could remove it, change it, or cover it up. And I could also lock down the font style, allowing others to be able to change the text, but ensuring that only my brand font was used, which is pretty slick and can really help you to enforce those brand guidelines. So moving right along, last tip number 4, respond faster to creative requests. So let me ask you a question. How long does it typically take your corporate marketing or design team to respond to requests for new or customized creative materials? So a flyer, anything we just talked about, it could be a business card, whatever it is. And similarly, if you're a designer, how long does it typically take you to fulfill all those requests? Well, obviously this is one of the questions that we asked in this survey. So as you can see from this graph, we asked all study participants about this, and the average time it takes to fulfill requests for new creative materials is pretty crazy. So nearly half of organizations, 48%, said it typically takes a week or more. And more than 1/5 of all the organizations who we surveyed said that it takes 3 to 4 weeks or even more than a month. So to me, that just kind of blows my mind. How many of you know exactly what you're going to be working on in a month? Like, I know I sure don't. Things just change so rapidly. And so how can we expect everyone else across the organization to be so well planned out in advance? So in the ever-changing world of marketing, we just need to be more nimble. So to dive in a little bit further, if we split that same graph, we see that for organizations with consistent brand presentation, so they already have pretty good brand consistency in the market, 40% report that it takes them less than a week, if you look at those shaded cells there, to fulfill those requests for new or customized materials. And you can compare this to those organizations with an inconsistent brand presentation already in the market, where just 24% respond to such requests in less than a week. So in other words, the brands who are doing it well are responding much faster to creative requests. So Ashley, I think you have some more tips for us here.
Yep, thanks so much, Garrett. Okay, how to respond faster to creative requests. The first step is to implement a request queue. If your team has no consistent way to receive work requests, maybe you're receiving them right now via email, but some people are handing them to you in a sticky note. Maybe someone's texting them to you. Maybe you're being stopped in the hallway. I've heard of people getting work requests in the bathroom, like while they're washing their hands. It can be major chaos, and I'm sure you've experienced that. There is definitely bound to be confusion about who wanted what when, and that confusion can affect the entire project from beginning to end. Your team may currently be receiving requests, of course, whether they're ad hoc or planned. Like I mentioned, maybe it's voicemail, maybe it's a ping, maybe it's a pat on the shoulder. But without that central repository for requests or a request queue that's implemented, your team will misunderstand, or misplace at least some of them, if not the majority of them, right? It's important to develop a standardized brief, though. So if you have a request queue, or if you have some plans, and I'm going to give you 3 ideas for that in a minute here, you need to make sure that your brief, or what people are filling out in order to request the project, is also standardized. That should include the information you need to accurately fulfill the request, right? So if you're the one responding to creative requests, obviously that's going to be important for you, a creative brief. Or if you're the one that's requesting work from the creative team, it's important that you give them a standardized set of feedback or a standardized set of information so that they can do their job to better help you. One marketing company that was managing 700 projects a year had 36,000 requests in that time period. Holy crap, we don't know what we're going to work on, 36,000 requests. I can't even imagine that. But since moving to a central location where they received all requests, they increased their on-time delivery to 98%. That's amazing. In a marketing department, to deliver projects at a 98% on-time delivery rate, that's incredible. Okay, so 3 ideas on how you can implement a request queue. The first one is an email address. Let's say you create a single email address like request@yourcompany.com. You can provide departments with a template for all the information they should include in every request, including, of course, a note regarding what to attach. This method can definitely work best when there's a single assigner. The second option is a virtual bulletin board. Maybe you're sharing virtual notebooks with requesters. They can provide request details as well as upload related images or content. The assigner can then, of course, email the information directly to team members. And the third option would be maybe a Google form. Requesters can fill out a customized Google form with relevant images and, of course, videos if you need. You can collect and organize the information online so it's accessible everywhere, as well as, of course, from the email form. The solution that we use internally, obviously, is Workfront, where we have an implemented request queue as part of our software, and people can't submit the request until they fill out the information that's required. So when someone needs something from my team, I have to know what audience they're talking to. Like harkening back to the first thing I mentioned, I need to know, are they talking to an agency? Are they talking to a general marketer? What do they need? I need that information in order to fulfill the request. The other thing, though, that I thought about while you were talking earlier, Garrett, is to maybe implement a new methodology. Maybe it's Agile in order to respond faster to that creative request. Our creative services team uses Agile, so they get requests through, of course, our request queue, and they put it into their sprint, and they plan out their week so they can actually see what they're going to be working on that week, right?
Well, Ashley, it's funny you mentioned that, just to jump in real quick, because yeah, our team actually here implemented that a few months back, and we've seen a lot of benefits from that as well. Just the efficiency of it has really helped us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of Agile for marketers. We use it on my team. Like I mentioned, the creative services uses it on their team, and it's not only fun to name your sprints, of course, but it's nice to see in a visual format what work you have to get done and push that forward, whether that's in progress or you're waiting on something, and of course to complete. It's really nice. It gives that visibility, which is so important. Okay, for the second part, it's really important that let's back up a minute. Let's say you get all of your requests finally into the same spot. Everything's coming into the right place. And now what, right? How do you prioritize that project or those projects against one another? Do you do it on a whoever's the loudest stakeholder, process? That's definitely something that I've experienced before. Well, so-and-so is my friend, so I'm going to do his work first, or so-and-so, he's really important to the organization, so I'm going to get his work done first, even though that's going to push off maybe this project that has a tight deadline or that requires my attention. No, the important thing to do here is to use a scorecard to prioritize those projects correctly. And we have 2 examples here. I'll share them with you. If you don't have a scorecard or you don't have a way to prioritize your projects, you can download these templates from our website, and I think we're going to have links at the end for easier access for you. But this example shows that you can prioritize marketing projects or, of course, whatever types of projects using a weighted point plan. So you determine the strategic value of a marketing project or a task request, so everything from a blog post to a video, by assigning weighted points based on the following criteria. And that would be the requester, the project task or type. Of course, that would mean that you need to look at the resources and the days that are required, and then, of course, the number of working days until the deadline. We recommend that, of course, those priorities should be revisited once a week, maybe in your sprint planning meeting if you're in Agile. Points, of course, would increase as deadlines approach. So, for example, a blog post that's requested by a manager with a deadline of 3 weeks, a relatively low-scoring project, would be at the bottom of your priorities list at the time of the request, but its point value will increase as the deadline grows closer. So if you download this document, I don't know if you can really read the small text on there, but I'll give you an example. Let's say it's the executive who requests something. He's going to get 20 points. Your peer is probably only going to get 5 points because the executive obviously has more clout than your peer. Let's say the project type is an email campaign. That's probably going to require like 15 points. If it's a like an internal only request, that's probably only going to get 5 points because that's not going to give much value to the business as far as externally. It's not going to bring in more business. It's just going to help someone internally, which of course is important, but on a weighted point schedule, not as important as an email campaign. Days to deadline. If you only have 2 days to complete it, probably 50 points. Right? You're going to need to weight that project much higher if you don't have as much time to work on it. If you have 15 plus days, I'd give it 5 points. Another option here, though, of course, is to use a template that uses a scale from 1 to 5. So if you're not interested in creating like a weighted point schedule or using the one that we have recommended here, you could use just a scale from 1 to 5. So that would mean that you would assign points, of course, again, from that scale of 1 to 5. So the requester, if it's an entry-level requester, let's say it's the intern who needs help, probably going to give him a 1. If it's the CEO, he's going to get a 5, or she's going to get a 5. Business value, no impact, a 1. If it's got huge material impact on the business, going to get a 5. No deadline, a 1. And if it's due yesterday, I'd give that thing a 5. And that kind of sums up the scorecard. Okay, so the third point for the responding faster creative requests, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is communicating in the context of the work. So I mentioned social collaboration, but it's important that, for me, what I focus on, and I think I mentioned this also earlier, that I work a lot on the review and approval process, which is why we're suggesting that asset, that last mile marketing projects. And in that process, you're reviewing and approving lots of documentation, right, or assets or whatever it is. And it's so important that the feedback that you are gathering on those assets is actually captured in the context of the work. So it's important to have a place or one location so that everyone can collaborate and see other people's feedback and provide their feedback or respond in the same location. So in order to respond faster to that creative request, I would recommend that you actually communicate in the context of the work, not outside of it. So if you have a meeting or some other conversation where you have important information that's important to that project, record it in the context of the work so that other people can stay up to date as well, and that'll help you respond faster to those creative requests. And that leads us to number 5. Garrett, I believe this one's yours.
It is, yeah, and this one might seem a little scary at first, but this last tip is to enable others to create their own materials when appropriate and when applicable. So just to illustrate this point, I have a quick story that I wanted to share. So a few months ago, I was talking to some graphic designers on a creative services team at a large network of hospitals and clinics. And they had told me that brand consistency was very important for their company. It's something that was pushed from tops down, and everyone knew that it was important to the executive team. And in order to enforce their brand guidelines, those executives had implemented a process that had prohibited anyone at the company who was not on their team from creating or updating materials. And instead, all of those requests were funneled through this one creative services team. And as a result, these designers said that the majority of their time was spent making tweaks or updates to existing materials, such as changing the date on a flyer from last year so they could reuse it this year. And they were spending all their time doing those things instead of working on the big, impactful design projects that they were hired to do and that they wanted to do. So I'm curious, does this situation sound familiar to any of you designers who might be listening, or those that work on a creative services team? You know, I'm sure that the company here was very well intentioned when implementing this process. I mean, they were trying to ensure brand consistency. That's what this whole webinar is about. That's what we're trying to say. It's important to do that. But they really went about it all wrong. And because when you think about it, think how much content, including, you know, marketing, communication, sales materials, think how much content your entire organization collectively creates in a given month. And, you know, with content only becoming more and more important in today's world, I'm sure that the volume of that content that your organization creates will only continue to increase. And marketers, designers, and creative services teams, they just can't be responsible for creating all of that content. Instead, what you should do is you should work to empower employees to create or tweak their own materials when appropriate and within the bounds of your brand standards, of course. And the best way to do that is to create a library of templates like we discussed previously, and that the employees can use those templates to create the simple materials that your organization creates most often. So if you're constantly bombarded with requests to update the date on a flyer for the events team, for example, why not create a template, and better yet, do it in Lucidpress and lock it down, right? Or another tool like that, so that you can ensure your brand consistency and allow those people across the organization to really self-serve and be able to create their own content, their own materials, and that really helps save you on the creative services team or the design team a lot of time. So I think that brings us about to the end. So just to sum up what we talked about today, the 4 tips to make your brand more consistent are: 1, pick the right brand champion; 2, make your brand guidelines easier to find; 3, ensure enforcement of those brand guidelines; and then 4, respond faster to those creative requests. So really, we hope that you all really enjoyed the webinar today. And again, we want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We know it's difficult to find that much time to spend with us, but we really appreciate you joining us. And so as promised, here are the links to download both of those reports, the Impact of Brand Consistency report and also the Last Mile of Marketing Projects white paper that Workfront put together. We've had a lot of questions come through in the last little bit about how can I get access to these things, and how can I get access to that Lucidpress style guide template. We're going to send this deck to you and all of these links and all these materials later on today after the webinar. And then in addition, the one plug I'd put in is if you're interested in learning more about how Lucidpress or Workfront can help you build a more consistent brand, please visit these links that you see here on the right side of the screen to sign up for a short demo. We'd love to show you what each of our products can do and how they can help enable you to build a more consistent brand. So with that, I think we're going to move on to Q&A. So I know we're about at the top of the hour and only have a few minutes here, but saw some really good questions come through. If you have other questions, please share them with us right now. Use that small chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen and let us know what questions you have. So Ashley, as I'm looking through these questions, one of the first ones we got early on was from Dylan. And he said, I work in the music industry, and bands have their logos, but the artwork with each single and album changes. How do you keep the brand relevant and strong, but also ever-changing in the artwork? Ashley, I don't know if you have any thoughts to that. If you wanted to kind of start off, and I can share some thoughts after.
Yeah. Let's see. I hope I can do this question justice. I'll try to apply it to some experience that I've had. In my last job, I worked for an online university, Western Governors University. They're a nonprofit. And we had the main house brand, which was Western Governors University, WGU. But then we also had individual state universities as well. So, for example, Washington, Texas, et cetera. I think now they might even have 4 or 5. I think at the time I worked there, it was only about 3 or so. And so it was important for us to understand how to maintain that. We had one marketing department, keep in mind, for all of them. So while we were running technically 4 universities, they were separate entities. We had a mothership brand, which was WGU. So it was important for us to keep consistency in that mothership brand, that WGU brand, but then also allow the states to have a little bit more flair, right? So for Washington, they had a separate color scheme. Even though that was different than the main mothership brand, it still played into the guidelines that we had set for them. So I think Texas was like a red color or something, and Washington was a green. So while our materials all looked similar, they definitely looked like they were in the same brand. They were different. The Washington stuff looked different than the Texas stuff, and it looked different than the main mothership brand based on the color scheme and the palettes. So I think it's important to recognize that while you need to have guidelines, sometimes those guidelines have to be broken in order to provide the best experience for the brand and the users of that brand. Because those that were attending WGU Washington weren't attending WGU, they were attending that state school, WGU Washington. So it was important that they had the separate identity.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think, we face something similar here. I mean, we're not a Lucid Software. The company that I work for is not a massive company, but we have 2 different products, 2 different brands that we have to maintain, as well as like that corporate brand. So one of the ideas that I had, thinking about this question, Dylan, is we actually have a blog post that we wrote not long ago on the Lucidpress blog about how to develop your brand identity. And I think when you spend some time thinking about what the attributes are or the characteristics of your brand, your high level, your corporate brand, in our case, then you think about how those attributes can apply in the different worlds of products, or in this case, with the changing artwork with different bands in the music industry. So it's important to think through what are the characteristics that you want people to think about, and when they interact with any aspect of your brand, any of your products or any of your sub-brands, you could say. And by outlining that and doing that activity, then you can start to think through how you can apply those characteristics in those different scenarios, like I said. And I think that that's one way to help maintain that overall brand consistency, still allowing for the individual personalization and customization within each of your channels or products, or in this case the different artists that you might be working with in the music industry, or the different album changes as well. So any other thoughts to that, Ashley?
No, I think that's great.
Awesome. Well, I know we are just about out of time. It looks like a lot of the other questions that we have on here are, can I get the links? And again, we're going to send those out here shortly hereafter. And so just again, we wanted to thank everyone for joining us in the webinar today. And we hope if you have any other questions, you think of something later, please feel free to email us, either Ashley or myself, and we would be happy to follow up with you and answer any other outstanding questions that you have. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we will talk to you all later.